What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and returning to the podcast this episode, longtime friend of the pod, John D. Caputo. That's right. That is right. Philosophical deconstructinaire, radical theologian. He's back on the podcast. He has a new book, What to Believe, 12 Brief Lessons in Radical Theology. And you know what's radical about this book about radical theology? Well, one, it's short, and you could finish it if you're new to it. It's readable. It condenses a lot of ideas that he's explored in big, deep, intense works. And look, he put out a new book, which gave me a really good reason to get to hang out with him on the internet, which is just freaking awesome. So if you enjoy this conversation, know that he's probably been on the podcast 15 times or so. Also, I helped him put together a website that has like entire classes he's taught on it. So those links will be there. They'll be on the post attached to this. But if you are new to Caputo and are trying to decide where to start, I used to tell everyone, go start with What Would Jesus Deconstruct? Great text. And if you're very Jesus-y, Christocentric-y type, still a great place to start. But if you're trying to get Caputo and his more recent texts and like how he's engaged Paul Tillich in radical theology, What to Believe, 12 Brief Lessons in Radical Theology is an excellent place to start. I mean, it's amazing. You'll hear in this conversation where we dig into some rather basic things around deconstruction and radical theology and religion's relationship to culture and that kind of thing. And then we'll pick up some conversations we've been having for a long time, including his radical theological version of panentheism and how it both is enticing, alluring, and makes some process people uncomfortable. Done, but we save that nerdy bit for the end. Anyway, it's always good to talk to Jack. Very glad to have him back on. And hope you enjoy it. Before we go into this podcast, I want to tell you something. If you're saying to yourself, Trip, how come all this exciting stuff like Jack Caputo, it's on the internet and it's just available for me and I can just download it when I want? Well, you know why? Because there's the people in the Homebrewed community, the people that went to homebrewedcommunity.com, they joined up and they donate each month. And on top of just knowing they help make something like this possible, sustainable for the masses, they get perks, including a members-only podcast feed with like access to hundreds of things that are just for them, and invites to fun live streams and Q&A things, and access to a whole bunch of classes that we've done, including some with Mr. Jack Caputo. So if you're saying to yourself, I want to help make this possible, go to homebrewedcommunity.com and join up. And for all of you that are members, thank you times a billion, because I have a real deep joy in getting to do this. I absolutely love it, and y'all make it possible. So check it out, and I really hope you enjoy this conversation with Jack. If you think of topics that we should talk about or questions we should unpack together, and you're like, Trip, have him back on and talk about this, then do it, because a reason to hang out with JC, Jack Caputo, is always a good reason to hop on the pod. Alrighty, here we go. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is Jack Caputo. And on top of all the other times he's been on the podcast talking about tons of his other books, he has a brand new book out, What to Believe. This is radical theology for the people. And you're quite the proselytizer of radical theology, Jack.
I'm putting in my 2 cents.
Yeah. Well,
it's a way to talk about what I do.
Yes.
Various ways you could call it. Various things you could call it.
Mm-hmm.
Radical's good, though. Well, the first book that I wrote in my own name, and that wasn't simply exegetical, or not simply, I mean, being exegetical is important. That wasn't primarily exegetical, was called Radical Hermeneutics. So I've always had a taste for the word radical, and I've used it off and on over the years. And then I think it might have been Jeff Robbins that said to me, well, if radical hermeneutics, why not radical theology? Mm-hmm. I said, why not? I mean, it's got a point. There's a value, there's a rhetorical, but also a speculative, theoretical value to the word. The word that I myself like is weak theology. But radical's got a little more currency, and so I'm happy to call it to describe it that way.
Well, one of the questions, or the question on the cover of the book, "What to Believe," is one of those that could really mean a million different things. And one of the things that you've tracked in your own work, in the way religion has reshaped its relationship with culture over time, and the way even the notion of belief has taken different shapes in relationship to different, like the modern or postmodern kind of accounts of truth and belief. Could you kind of help us unpack, like, just what's happening with the title, "What to Believe"? Like, what is belief when it gets weak or gets radical?
That was a negotiated title. The original title was 12 Brief Lessons in Radical Theology. And the people at Columbia said, come on, we need something sexier than that. And so I came back and I said, well, how about, what do we really believe? And they said, okay, that's getting warm. And then they said, how about just what to believe? And I said, okay, but we really got to make sure there's a question mark at the end of that, right? I am not proclaiming what to believe. So I think religion, by and large, is making itself more and more unbelievable with each passing day. I don't mean to put you out of business here, but
well, if someone's going to do it, it should be someone I like.
I don't want to wipe out religion, but I think religion is disgracing itself at the present time, and it's literally making itself unbelievable. I mean, it's becoming the recourse of people who are anti-scientific and reactionary, and they don't even believe in science and medicine anymore. I mean, they're reactionary from almost every point of view, culturally, intellectually, religiously. So what's left to believe if religion itself has become unbelievable? We make a distinction between belief and faith, where belief's a body of propositions, a body of assertions, creedal beliefs, as opposed to faith, where faith is a more fundamental orientation of your being. And beliefs then tend to be culturally acquired. And I like to say, a belief is something that's inside your head in virtue of an accident of birth. The high theologians like to talk about the gift of faith. Right? Well, the gift of faith is pretty much an accident of birth. But I think that there's something going on in beliefs, religious traditions, that's substantive and real and profound and important, and we don't want to lose it. So what do we really believe in these inherited beliefs? That's what I mean. So the radical means making a distinction between a belief that could be formulated in the form of a proposition or a creed from a deeper orientation of your being, which could take many forms. And so that your beliefs can shift, but this deep set orientation of yourself is steady. If you lose your belief, that's okay. What that means is you're revising your thinking. But if you lose your faith in that sense, then you're in trouble.
Yeah.
That's what Kierkegaard calls the sickness unto death. I mean, then you're in trouble. That's the point of the title.
No, I think that's really helpful. And one of the things that I think it might be helpful to really have you unpack is how do you see that story where culture became something distinct from religion? If we think of this task of faith as something that gets itself done in this symbolic register, when we skip back in time, there was 500 years ago, Charles Taylor does the bit. If you asked someone if they believed in God, they'd be like, well, that's an interesting question. I didn't know this was one of the options. It's just there. And then the God they were referring to, depend on where you lived. There's the official version. And most people grew up in a world where it's like we were all in the same cathedral. So all the light of reality shaped by the same big stories and rituals and such. And now we're at a point where it's not like human beings don't ask those questions or raise these kind of towards the undeconstructibles and all these kinds of things. But in that time, religion has shifted from something that was shared to then kind of the emergence of culture, and then thinking theologically about culture. And at that point, that content informed distinction, or like what to believe and to engage faith, becomes something different than it would have back in the day?
Well, and the answer is what Taylor says. It's modernity. It's the church's reaction against modern science, which was really reactionary. And when the part of the Catholic Church, it was shocking that the church did that, because the church never taught the literal meaning of the scripture. I mean, it said that there was a literal meaning, but it said there were levels of meaning. There were, I think, 4 levels of meaning, beginning with literal, going all the way up to metaphorical and symbolic. So it was never committed to a literal interpretation. But it was stampeded by Copernicus. And Copernicus himself, I mean, as I'm sure you know, did not publish that book during his lifetime. He got a friend to write a preface to it, saying, publish it after his death, saying, well, this is a good guide for mariners. So, it's a lot simpler. It's like the short proof when your math teacher gives you the short proof. Well, look, it's a lot simpler if you just assume the sun's in the middle. So the church was worried that this conflicted with what the scripture literally meant. I mean, Thomas Aquinas would time and time again say, when we say God, distinguish the levels of analogy. And he said, well, sometimes the scripture is just talking metaphor. When he said God is a rock, doesn't mean God's a rock. And the church knew that. So what's the difference between saying God is a rock and saying the sun is, the earth is a rock going around a fire? Nicholas of Cusa pleaded with that, to back off on that. He says, this is a serious mistake. He was also their vicar to Islam. And he was trying to he had a conception of world religion. And he had a profound scientific understanding of the world, didn't think the earth was in the center of the universe. And he was a cardinal, pleaded with the church not to do this. And then it never got fixed. And it couldn't deal with Luther, and couldn't deal with science. And you end up with this notion of religion is feeling and science is reason. I mean, Tillich's theology of culture is the fix for that, but as you say, it's a fix to a problem that didn't exist in the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm. In the book early on, Tillich is a helpful interlocutor, along with switching around the font for God. When I opened it and saw that God, this is the big God of big being in the most supreme sense. Definitely a male, though. I'm sure they would say that it's the proper language to use, Jack. But we aren't projecting a phallus on the divine. But he definitely does not exist, and he gets his own font. Could you kind of take that notion of God in a special font? That is even cooler than when David Ray Griffin called that God Gawd, and he put Gawd, just so you had to say it with ignorant preacher voice. Gawd. But I'm going to have to come up with something later in life for ontotheology, and you've got a font. Griffin got a whole new spelling, so I don't know what I'm going to do. But yeah, that's what I'm going to do in my 80s. But Tillich and the God.
Yeah, I mean, this book, as you will have noticed, has an autobiographical slant to it. And I grew up in an intensely Catholic world in the I was born in 1940, so I grew up in the 40s and the 50s. So this was a time of Pius XII in Rome and President Eisenhower in Washington. It was a neighborhood of basically Irish and then second Italian Catholics. And I hardly even knew any Protestants. And we were utterly immersed in the church. We all lived in walking distance to our parish. There were parishes all over West Philadelphia, all over Philadelphia. And it was the Latin Mass. So this was pre-Vatican II. It was a church that had not changed basically in 400 years. It went back to the Counter-Reformation Council of Trent. and they froze the teachings of the church. So that I had the sense it just dropped from the sky. The Council of Trent had a date in time and had something to do with the books, the catechism we were using. That was it. I didn't pay no attention to that. This was from God. This was from God through what we called Holy Mother, the Church, and everything's in Latin. So we had missals for when we went to church, in which the Latin was on the left side of the page, and the English translation was on the right side. Actually, it was columns. So there would be the left column of the page would be Latin, and the right column was English. And the Latin was in Gothic. Okay, so here is this dead language, right? A dead language has a great advantage. You can say definitively what these words mean because nobody's around to make a metaphor or write a new poem or say something different. It's a dead language. It's frozen. Here came the eternal truth down from heaven through Holy Mother of the Church in Latin, in Gothic. And we had a Baltimore Catechism. It was the name of it because Baltimore was sort of the Rome of American Catholicism. So I wanted to deconstruct this God. And I thought, I was putting it in scare quotes. And then I thought, you know what? I'm sure this can be done. How about we put it in the Gothic font? Right? And I had to go back and forth with Columbia 3 or 4 times to hit just the right Gothic font. I said, well, that's perfect. So now when I say God does not exist, I can use this Gothic thing. That's the one, that guy, with the big guy in the sky, as they say. That's the one that does not exist. But that's not the end of God in some other sense. And then, as you say, it's Tillich is my man. If you look at the introduction to, or the acknowledgments of the book, you'll see that I make reference to, I dedicated to Brother Paul. Well, the Brother Paul was the Catholic. I went to a Catholic high school, of course, and I had this Christian brother, De La Salle brother, who conducted the school, and had one in particular who just sort of took me under his wing, and he says, you know, if you could get rid of the Philadelphia isms, you could be a good writer. And he worked with me, and I just adored him. And I entered that order and spent 4 years. And that's where I came into philosophy. So I discovered philosophy in the context of religion and theology and of a pre-Vatican II world. And in Catholicism, when you want to study theology, it's not Bible thumping and chorus practice and choral practice. It's philosophy. It's metaphysics. It's Thomas Aquinas. So I had to immerse myself in Thomas Aquinas. And in doing that, I caught the bug, the philosophical bug. I said to my superiors, I don't want to, they were training me to be a high school teacher. I said, I don't want to be a high school teacher. I want to teach theology. I want to teach philosophy, and I want to go to the college, not the high schools. And they say, well, look, here's the way the vow of obedience works. You don't tell us what you want to do. We tell you what you're going to do. And that's when we parted ways. But it was a friendly party because I love those people. They saved my life. You know, I would have been, I don't know what I would have been without if I had not entered that order. And then I started rethinking. Then Vatican II. Then Vatican II. And that opened the window. The joke was Pope John XXIII wanted to open the windows. He didn't want everybody to jump out. But we did. A lot of us did. Empty, religious orders emptied. And then I just started this journey of not blowing up the thing, because I didn't want to blow it up, but rethinking it. And so one way to put it is, what's the event that's going on in this thing, which is what we really treasure, as opposed to its incrustations and formulations and institutionalizations and doctrinalizations. You know, what's really going on there, and so what do we really believe? What is it that you really believe? And that's the project of a radical rethinking of theology, which is also just as well called, I like to call it weak theology, because it weakens the doctrinal element in order to bear or expose the more radical element. Or you can also call it theopoetics, like Catherine Keller and others do. which weakens the logos of theology to a poetic, because that's what I think it is. And that's also why we were just talking about Schelling before we started. That's why Schelling was so important, because Schelling had this notion of a creative imagination, which was not just simply a clever, conscious imagination, but was collaborated with the unconscious. So these images that we bring forth in art and religion are visceral. They're coming from the bowels of our being. And so there's something profoundly important in them. That's why Schelling was very interested in mythology. He thought that mythology is not just crazy stuff. Mythology is giving word to what later on Tillich calls the ground of being.
Yeah.
And it's doing it in a deeply sensuous way. He and Hegel agreed about that, but Hegel said, yeah, but that's for people who can't understand philosophy, right? Religion is philosophy for people who can't understand philosophy. So what you ultimately do with these profound images, which Hegel recognized, I mean, you look at Hegel's philosophy of religion, he says wonderful things about religion as a sensuous mode of the spirit. But he thought, ultimately, there's a philosophical begriff which grabs it all and comprehends it, a concept, which clarifies it. And Schelling said, it's this imaginative figuration all the way down. It can be interpreted, but it can't be comprehended. And there's a guy sitting in the audience taking furious notes while Schelling's saying all this. Guy from Denmark who just broke off his engagement by the name of Søren Kierkegaard. Mm-hmm. So that sort of opened the door, didn't it? To postmodern, whatever we want to call it, radical theology.
And here's something that continues to show up, especially since 2016, and then in lockdown, the number of people who were in confessional Christian spaces and then have a WTF moment because there's beliefs becoming unbelievable because you're told to believe something dumb. And then there's beliefs coming unbelievable because you have no idea how what Jesus said, did, and endured is related to what is claimed as fidelity ethically, right? Where it's just the lack of correspondence falsifies whatever you thought you were talking about. And for individuals in that space, I think back to so many of our conversations early on in the podcast, 15 years ago and more at this point, it was intellectual questions that were bringing deconstruction up. Now it's more and more these ethical ones. And a regular question that comes up where I go, I wish Jack was sitting here right now, is something like, yes, religion, when it functions as like a set of beliefs, we have to believe this and this, that's no good. But also this description of religion that's popular on the outside in a more secular space that deflates the claims of religion, diminishes its power and stuff, also seems problematic to those who the story of Jesus still animates them, even though they don't know where to go. Right. And I think one of the gifts this book does, by using your own story coming out of Catholicism in the framing, is to go, what if the belief place is where we need to start our reworking? What if what believing looks like, you can affirm a giant depth dimension that can seize your life and orient it towards beauty and goodness and justice. And you don't have to close your hand around these ideas you don't know what to think yet about. Like, to me, that opening, you were just imagining Kierkegaard sitting there listening to Schelling, where there's something that needs to be preserved in the depth dimension, in the symbolic and such, that religions have a certain kind of grace at helping us encounter. Can you kind of address that? Like, what is being preserved as you rework and reorient one's relationship to, beliefs in Gothic?
Well, at the very end, I refer to it as the axiological. So there's a movement from theology as theism to what Tillich calls the ontological, or panentheism, to what I finally come up with as the axiological, or theopoetic, which is the word axios in Greek means something that we revere for itself. It's not transactional. It's not something we trade in for a reward. It's something inherently, intrinsically worthy of honor and respect and admiration. Worth in the sense of intrinsic worthiness. So towards the end, I say you should believe what you love, not love what you believe. It's loving what we believe that is corrupting belief. But we believe in what we love. And I think that religion at its best, if we still want to save this word, and I don't know about you, but I'm not even sure of this word anymore. Religion at its best is precisely that. It's the thing is, and I argue this. I've been arguing this in a bunch of different books in the last 10 years or so. What we have to do is drop the mystification, the self-mystification in religion, which is the supernaturalism. The notion that somehow or another believers are people who have been gifted by some supernatural intervention, which gives them a kind of privileged standing, privileged access to something that the rest of us who don't have the gift of faith are just left out of. Get rid of that. The people who wrote the scriptures were human beings, and they were telling stories. And they were telling stories about something that they could barely comprehend. It's something profoundly mysterious, profoundly worthy of respect, the mystery of our life, the mystery of the stars and the moon. What's that? Is anybody else up there? Where did we come from? Why? They're writing stories about that, and the scriptures lasted because they were good stories, and there were people who were as baffled as you and I are about these things, but they were good storytellers. So religion is very, very close to art. That's why I like this expression, theopoetics. It is a kind of literature. It is a kind of art, but it's a kind of art that has ultimate consequences, ultimate import, is something what's ultimately at stake in life is going on there. And I think that's also true of art too, but there's something different about this. Hegel had an interesting thing, as you well know. He said, well, there's three forms of the absolute spirit, three of everything, right? And then of the three, these are the forms of the absolute spirit. Highest is philosophy, the lowest is art, and religion's in the middle. He says, art is the most sensuous form of the spirit. It's important. The work of art, we resonate with the powers of being in and through the work of art. Philosophy is where the absolute clears its head. And he says, religion's in the middle. He says, religion is more conceptual than art, but it's more sensuous than philosophy. Mm-hmm. So religion is kind of in a Goldilocks spot there. Right in the middle, it's got this depth content that he sees in philosophy. And it's also got everything that art has going for it. Right? It's got all that sensuous, unconscious, affective power to bring the concept to sensuous form. And the only thing you say, well, Hegel's right about all that. The only thing is, forget the philosophy part, because there isn't any philosopher who's going to come along and clear this up. So it's left to the creative, productive, sensuous imagination to figure this. Now, that's what's important in religion. And it's endlessly important. It simply needs to understand that it has to keep redoing itself because our imaginary keeps shifting. I mean, the imaginary of the ancients was one thing, that when they looked up at the heavens. When we look up at the heavens, we say, Carl Sagan calls this pale blue dot.
Yeah.
In immensity. We literally cannot comprehend, right?
Yeah. We just got new pictures. We get a new telescope and our cosmology has to shift. We discovered that there are solar systems way earlier than our current physics said they could exist. That's it's one of those those situations, right, where our understanding of the world, like our imaginary, is the very fabric. These big questions that orient humanity, get itself done, It's just our imaginary at this point shifts at a pace. Very few of us have time to comprehend it and understand it. And yet, to be human and take existence seriously puts us back at the campfire that human beings had a million years ago going, so how do we live before we die? What's good? What's just? What's beautiful? And how do we figure out? Do what?
What's that stuff up there? Those little stars?
Yeah, these questions have always been there. In many ways, we have a growing awareness that certain questions existed before we had language to say much about them. Religion emerges first through trance, mystic type experiences, group dancing and singing before anything like linguistic, right? I guess it was 2 years ago. I was at a conference when I was in Edinburgh on the science and religion faculty, but taught the philosophy classes in the program, like philosophy of religion type stuff. And we had a big consultation thing I got invited to, and I'm sitting there with mostly scientists who are studying religion, and they'd done a number of papers where they get done and goes something like this. It's really depressing to us atheist scientists that if we want our kids to be less likely to use drugs, cheat, they want more moral outcomes, human flourishing, less depression and self-harm and stuff, they should be involved in some religious group, that your quality of life, length of life, all this stuff's better. But also, we know that if you're in there, your in-group, out-group stuff is going to get activated in ways that you're likely to express prejudice at higher rates. And so what are we doing with this? We need to invent religion for all the people that don't have it so that they don't get depressed, drink, and kill themselves or get on Oxycontin. Like, they're sitting there with this. But also, we got to worry what happens in an increasingly pluralistic world where those structures are sit there. And, they're all given these papers, and they go, well, what would you do? I was like, I think this is why we need more theopoetics. I was like, because it takes seriously the depth dimension and this kind of inherited wisdom and all the ritual stories and everything that's there. And when it goes to the tribal thing, it kind of has to open up its hand and go, I don't know, perhaps. And when I was reading this book, I kept thinking, this is the kind of thing I'd like to have hand to much more. People never mess with religion and are scientists going, we're going to have to invent one. Because humans, we don't know what to do without it. And I think it's really that depth dimension that you're getting at that's been intrinsic to human community and stories and flourishing, that it's theopoetics and such.
But it's beginning to take cosmic proportions. It's doing two things. On the cosmological level, it's the sense of mystery. Is the James Webb telescope. The sense of mystery is cosmic now, in a way that it wasn't before, even 100 years ago. I mean, this has been recognized before. I mean, Pascal talked about the sense of being a lonely universe, but his conception of the universe was much more constricted. So you've got this astonishing revelation of, and it is a revelation of the scope of the universe, maybe multiple universes. On the one hand, the other thing going on is AI. And the breakdown of the Donna Haraway's thing about the breakdown of these borders between human and non-human, living and non-living. When Einstein demonstrates the convertibility and transformability of energy and matter, I mean, what happens to this? The old imaginary of body and soul and eternity and time. That all that stuff is not blown up. It's deconstructed, it's disrupted, it's interrupted, and it has to be reimagined. I actually think that the more mystical and that there's a whole field, new field for religion and mysticism in the new cosmology and what's going on in AI. But although it's risky business, the AI stuff is, we all thought it was going to be emancipatory, but it's been profoundly disruptive. I mean, whoever thought we'd be arguing about the validity of science or vaccines, right? I mean, deconstruction was first formulated in the 60s as a reaction against totalitarianism. The deconstructors all thought, the whole post-structuralist movement thought, well, these structures are in place. They're massive. They're never going to go away. The thing to do is try to make some space in them, make room for innovation and difference and novelty. But we never thought the whole damn thing would collapse. And it didn't collapse because of post-structuralism. It collapsed because of AI. It collapsed because of the internet. It collapsed because you can get on Amazon and review a book that you don't have any understanding of and affect the fate of that book. And all you need to be how to do is push a button that says on, and you're online. Talk about the coming of what you can't see coming.
Yeah.
You once asked me, in fact, this is Advent. You once asked me about 10 years ago to say something about Advent. And I think we were at an AAR, and you had a microphone, and you stuck it in my face. You say something, what do you think about Advent? And I said, deconstruction is Advent. It's the coming of what we can't see coming. But, that's intended in a full sense. But it's also very risky business. So we're in a new imaginary. Religion has to reimagine itself in a new way. And it's a good deal of it is quite dangerous.
Well, one of the things you do in the book to help do that is, and this is a topic you've spent time on in multiple books, and pulling out of your kind of engagement with Derrida, but is kind of opening up what prayer looks like in this different mode of engagement. Thinking of those who perhaps now find the God to whom one would have prayed so unbelievable they don't know what to do with the impulse. What's the invite for prayer on terms of theopoetics and such?
That is a really good question. I think religion and prayer are coextensive. If you're talking about religion and you don't have some notion of prayer, I don't know what you're talking about. Or theology. Theology and religion are coextensive with the sphere of prayer, the prayerful. Now, the sort of prayer that I keep at arm's length is petitionary prayer, not because there's anything wrong with desire, but because petitionary prayer is this mystification, praying for the victory in the Super Bowl, or praying for very serious things like the healing of cancer, of a tumor or something. I think that's a mystification of what prayer is. I think prayer is our point of contact with, let's keep the language Tillichian because it's more felicitous in this situation. Prayer is our contact with the ground of being. Prayer is our sense of openness to the mystery. It is, in its depth, I think, a meditative prayer. It's this caesura in life where we just stop. And when we were in the religious life, it was a life of prayer and labor, orare et laborare, prayer and labor, work. And they said, your whole life should be a prayer. We said, oh, wait, how you can't make your whole life a prayer? We were supposed to be high school teachers, we got a class. And they said, at the beginning of every hour, of every class, of every hour of the day, you pause and say, let us remember that we are in the holy presence of God. And you dedicate that hour to that your life itself is a prayer. Let us remember that we are in the holy presence of what is calling upon us, addressing us. Now, the thing about prayer is that we always think of it as praying to somebody. When you think about God, you can say God's not a being, but God's grounded being, but that doesn't stop you from thinking that there's a being there when you say God. When you say God, you think of something. It's not a thing. It's a no thing. It's ground. It doesn't stop you. It's this subject-object frame is in our head. We're not going to get that out of there. It's unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know what it is. It is the way we think about the world. So when we think about God, we think about God as somebody. I don't think God is somebody or something. So what we're doing is personifying. But personification is not a bad thing. Personification is one of these imaginative operations in which we establish a relationship with something of profound importance. Suppose you're going through the attic and you're cleaning up the attic and you come across the hat of your favorite uncle. Love the guy. He was, everybody laughed. He was a sweetheart. and he was sort of the the jewel of the family. Everybody. He's been dead for a while now, and you inadvertently come across this hat. You talk to it, right? Uncle Harry, I don't know where you are now. And you talk to it. Or you talk to the old family home, a tree, anything. That personification, something's getting itself said and done there. That's not just Feuerbachian projection, right? That Feuerbachian projection is a half-truth. We do project, but we project because we've been injected by something that's got us before we knew it. So personification is a profoundly important way and necessary way to make contact with things that are deeply important to us. And I think that's when we talk about personal prayer, that's what that is. Tillich said, the ground of being is not a person, but it's not impersonal, it's pre-personal. It's the ground of persons. And so a person is an emergent property of the ground of being. A person is a revelation or manifestation or expression of the ground of being. So it's telling us something about the truth of being. So personal prayer is a way of making contact with something of elemental import. And religion is all about dealing with things of elemental import. And so if it's just simply a debate about a speculative debate about the origin of the universe or something like that, that's not it. We mentioned Kierkegaard. It is, in Kierkegaardian terms, deeply existential. It has to do with the meaning of our lives, and not just our lives, but of all of us. And not just all of us, but the globe, the world.
In like thinking of that notion of prayer, then the prayer Jesus gave his disciples and the centrality of the kingdom, the coming kingdom in it. Do you see that as a way of giving direction, in a sense, to that dimension?
That's ours, the kingdom. The kingdom is ours. That's the thing that's in my head, in your head, and we can't get it out. I mean, this topsy-turvy, upside down, first or last, inside or out, poor or privileged, rich have to get through a needle, all that. God chose the weak and the foolish and the nobodies. All that. That's our symbol. That's our, not the vision we have, but the vision that has us. And yeah, I mean, it could go other people, other times, other places might have different symbols, but that's ours. And see, my training is in philosophy, right? I am technically, officially, people call me a theologian, but I'm a philosopher. But I'm a philosopher who rejects the distinction between supernatural and natural. I just think it's all some kind of poetics or phenomenology. So the kingdom is this, from a point of view of a philosopher, is a stunning notion. Aristotle would have looked at that and he would say, people are crazy. Who is the prudent man that Aristotle talks about? It's beautiful. It's wonderful stuff, Aristotle. Who is he talking about? He's talking about well-educated, good-looking, wealthy guys. He is not talking about 1 Corinthians 1. He is not talking about God chose the nothings and the nobodies, and you are not well born. I mean, Paul really lets him have it. No disguises, no soft peddling it. That's the kingdom. See, that form of life, because it's not a theory. If you want to call it anything, call it a poem. It's a poetizing of a form of life which preserves the memory of Jesus. Jesus was its poet. And then in Christianity, he became the poem. But I think he himself was a sort of first-order theo-poet. He wouldn't have known what we were talking about if we used that word. He was a sort of first-order theo-poet. He was the poet poetizing this kingdom. I mean, you ask him, I once attended a lecture, and the lecture was entitled, Jesus' Theology of God. What did Jesus think about God? The historical Jesus person. And he said, well, he doesn't really talk about God. he talks about the kingdom of God. And he doesn't really talk about the kingdom of God. He talks about leaven and treasures in the field and the lilies of the. He says he's a poet, and the kingdom is his poem, but it's a theo poem.
In could you say a bit there about that? Like when thinking about prayer, thinking about that image of the kingdom within Christianity, how does a theopoetics or radical theology see the relationship between religion and its communities and desire formation?
Well, I don't think there would be desire formation without communities. There would be no memory of Jesus without communities. It would have just been completely forgotten. We're working with religious traditions are shared memories and transmitted memories. The problem with it is they become full of themselves, right? These communities, and then they become self-preservative, and they forget that they're supposed to get out of the way, become transparent. They like Jean-Luc Marion's distinction between an icon and an idol.
Mm-hmm.
So they tend to become opaque and make themselves the point. But they're absolutely indispensable, and they're a pain in the neck, a menace. So you need what my man Derrida calls communities without community. You know, the word community literally means communis. The munis in communio means munitions. It means force, power, and defensive force. So a community is a fort. It is fortified on every side. Communio, as being with one or one union, is a pious etymology. It's not the scientific etymology. So communities are dangerous. They fortify themselves, and once you have a community, you have the power of excommunication, if it's a strong community. So you want weak communities, right? You want communities without community. I mean, the history of communities is the history of communities reforming themselves. They form, a breakthrough occurs, a community occurs, as you're putting it, a community of desire is formed. There's an originary creative passion, and then it becomes a community, and then it becomes too strong. Then we need to break it up, and a new community forms. And then what happens? It catches on, and it becomes too strong. So you need them in a constant state of deconstruction, and that's what deconstruction means. It doesn't mean blow things up. It means keep them in the way I like to put it is keep them in a state of optimal disequilibrium. So they don't quite fall over, but they're a little unstable, a relatively unstable stability. Communities are where it happens, because with communities you have texts, you have traditions, you have discourse, and desire is shaped by that, and desire shapes it. So it's back and forth between the two. But you have to keep them unstable. That's the problem, with Catholicism. Catholicism misunderstands what it means to be a tradition. A tradition is a transmission process, and so it's constantly changing. And if it doesn't, it'll disappear. And with Protestantism, which confuses itself with a book. Books are meant to be read and reread. Once it's written down, it's open territory. It's open to reinterpretation. Hermeneutics arose once as Luther translated the Bible. We needed the theory of how to read it, because then everybody could read it. So these communities form around these things, but they have to be plastic.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned there hermeneutics, and earlier in the conversation you talked about your first book having a kind of radical hermeneutics, and then even more. Once you start adding even more to the sequel, there's a kind of drilling down that's happening with an idea. Another one of those that you've picked up multiple times in drilling down is the role of the undeconstructible in the process of deconstruction, in that task of kind of generative interpretation. And I find that to be a helpful place for people that might be fearful or hesitating at jumping into the abyss of hermeneuticing in such. Can you kind of unpack the way a deconstruction opens up space for encountering something that perhaps we've been protecting ourselves from in clinging to any particular instantiation of a tradition?
Yeah, that's kind of been my lifelong spiel, that what you're saying, bringing up now. When I use the expression radical hermeneutics, hermeneutics was conceived within a theological context. And so the idea was there was this deposit of truth, which had a kind of inexhaustibility about it, which we needed to find some way to gain access to. But there was always an assumption behind it of a kind of eternal truth or a kind of inexhaustible truth that was just a matter of getting an angle on it. What I called radical hermeneutics was hermeneutics sort of when you expose its feet to the fire of deconstruction. Because what deconstruction will say is, well, look, all of these truths, all of these inherited traditions are constructions to begin with. And part of the reason this tradition has survived is violence. We just we erased all the other. There were probably how many gospels were there originally? Right, probably hundreds of them. But this imperial power called Nicaea decided, and the church that was forming around it decided to canonize certain things and uncanonize the rest. Put the canon to the others. So the radical and radical hermeneutics is taking this deconstructive angle in mind and saying, look, the inherited tradition is also the object of suspicion, not simply a gift. It is a gift, but gifts can also be poison. Okay. Now, if you push that too hard, then you get the reputation that deconstruction got, right? Which is that's what it does. It goes around destabilizing things. It was not until 1989. If you would have asked me or anybody else who studied Derrida before 1989, is there something undeconstructible? We would say, no, whatever has been constructed is deconstructible and what has not been constructed. So in 1989, Drusilla Cornell invites Derrida to the Cardozo Law School. Cardozo Law School, liberal, radical law school, right? She asked him to give a talk on deconstruction and justice, like it's almost a challenge. What could deconstruction have to do with justice? Because it's just a bunch of razzle dazzle. So he gives this talk in which he talks about the undeconstructibility of justice. Well, the people in that audience were like the first act of the producers. They're sitting there with, what? He just said undeconstructible? Justice is undeconstructible? And he says, Ciliana, if there is such a thing, which it does not exist, justice. But that's why we desire it. That's why we love it. So what is justice? Now, Derrida, now people are starting to say, if somebody actually has read Derrida, there are people who badmouth him and have not read him. But if somebody is bad-mouthing him or criticizing him and has actually read him, then they're liable to say, not that he's a crazy razzle-dazzle relativist, but that he's a Platonist, which is exactly the opposite. He said, well, why would you say that? Because the undeconstructible is this eternal form. Justice is an eternal form. This is Plato. No. He says justice if there is such a thing. So what is it? It's the promise that is lodged in the word justice now we desire, that we're hoping for. What will it look like? I don't know. It's the coming of what we can't see coming, right? I don't know what it'll look like. All we know is that what we call justice, there's something going on in what we call justice that we desire, with a desire beyond desire, because we desire this, we desire that, we desire a new hat, we desire a job, we desire this, that, or the other thing, but there's a desire we have, which is a desire beyond desire, for something we know not what. St. Augustine's cor inquietum, the restless heart. Justice is the least bad word we have for something that we desire with a desire beyond desire. It's not a Platonic form. You can't approach it asymptotically because you don't know what it is. It's not an essence. It's a call. Now, that's what deconstruction is about. It is about the deconstructibility of all of the present forms of justice or peace or art or education or science or anything. The deconstructibility of that in the light of what we desire with a desire beyond desire. If I were in charge of the thing, I would not have let the word deconstruction take over. I would have called it a philosophy of the event, which is the name for the undeconstructible. It is better described as a philosophy or a hermeneutics of the event, something like that. But the word deconstruction caught fire. He didn't mean it to be the word. He was commenting on Heidegger, and so he's writing in French, and he comes to Heidegger's word destruction. So he says in French, destruction, and then he sort of hit him at the moment, the way you do when you're writing, and he says or deconstruction, and he keeps on going. And caught fire, and it's a great word. I mean, it is a good word, but he spent 20 years trying to explain what it does not mean. That's what I have against the word pantheism. You spend 2 hours explaining to someone what you don't mean, because what you do mean is called panentheism, right? Well, the same thing's true with deconstruction. Or like the theory of relativity. Einstein said, God, why did I call it the theory of relativity? I should have called it the theory of the absoluteness of the speed of light. And same thing's true with deconstruction. It's about the undeconstructible, not destroying things. So the task of what I first call hermeneutics or radical hermeneutics or deconstruction or weak theology or theopoetics, all of that is that project of exposing the contingency of the formations, the beliefs and practices that we have and we need. If we didn't have them, we'd be nothing. In the light of what we book called hoping against hope. It's not the hope for this or that. It's the hope that is us. Not the hope we have, it's the hope which has us, which is the undeconstructible. It's not eternal. It's not immutable. It's not an essence. It does not exist. It insists it does not exist.
Yeah. When I was trying to describe that with students once, who pressed on the Platonic form bit, right? Like, so is this just, like, well, I have a single form. And I was like, well, it's like a form, but just the energy of it. It's just the energy of the form. and a student started saying, so justice is Platonic fusion. And I was like, I think I'm going to borrow that. Now I'm going to try it out on Jack. But I was like, yeah. It's like, it's all the energy that sits there. It gives the judgment, the demand, like all that kind of like, it throws the event into a different kind of seriousness. But when the event's over, it was still just that event. But it doesn't mean the next moment that the fusion might not happen again. But no form. It doesn't.
Yeah, the forms are formations that are transient.
Yeah,
and provisional. They're all. I mean, you need them, otherwise it would be chaos. But they're provisional.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a sense of their contingency. But yeah, I love calling it energy, because energy takes form, and it gets transformed and takes forms. But it's not the form; it's the energy of the form. That's good. I'm going to use that.
Well, one of the things about it is that, that relationship of matter and energy, and I think part of the theopoetics critique towards most conversations about God is that most God talk is substance abuse. It ontologizes or gives substance to something that once you do that, like, you're missing the point. And one of the things I love about your work, it is like non-apologetic about I'm not doing that. You're like, I'm not doing that because I actually care about what I'm talking about, as opposed to engaging and slowly trying to pull people one direction or like reformulate it. And in this book, the 12 lessons kind of build cumulatively to go like, I'm just want you all you religious people to know you're engaging in a form of substance abuse, and sometimes you just have to dial it back a little bit and manage to put your life back together and attempt to be an adult. But I'm thinking you'll have a real problem, and so much of it's tied to that not realizing that energy. There are places energy exists without matter, but there is no place there's matter without energy. And so if you pretend one's primary and it's derivative, then you shouldn't be surprised that your God talk has some ontology problems.
Yeah. Did you notice, by the way, in this book that I've gotten closer and closer and warmer to panentheism?
I want you to know
that was going to be your first question.
Well, I told you I wanted to loosen things up. People, there's so many people that listen to the podcast and didn't know that on multiple occasions after, I guess, your second time on the podcast, maybe like 14 years ago, you said that, well, after a couple glasses of wine at dinner with Catherine Keller, I might lapse into something approximating process. So then I arranged multiple occasions where you had wine or beer and we're at tables with Catherine Keller and company. And, some people say, Trip, who knows what the hell you believe? Are you even a real Christian anymore? Are you evangelist? And now I just say, well, look, I've been praying for Jack for years. And there's some panentheism creeping in these pages. And so, I just feel like I've been laying the lure out.
You have. I've succumbed. I think that panentheism is, as you can see in this thing, it's kind of a transitional state to. Here's the thing about panentheism, and I'm interested in your take on it. There's a reasonably good probability, and it's a widely received theory, that the universe is running down. The law of entropy is inevitable, and the arrow of time is irreversible. And the best estimate we have right now is that the whole thing's going to end up in the expansion will expand to the point that things will just simply break down. Now, if you've transferred the divine goods from eternity to time and from substance to process, panentheism sort of left holding the bag of the expansion of the universe. If you want to call that the body of God, then the body of God is mortal. Now, I'm saying, so my view is, okay, if you want to call this the body of God, the cosmos, then the body of God's mortal. The part that I would object to, the part that I do object to, is in metaphysical theories that are anything more than sort of projections, tentative projections of what we think is going on. Right. So as long as your metaphysics is tentative, then I'm not interested in overcoming metaphysics. If by metaphysics you mean a tentative projection based upon the best evidence we have available. But if you want to say as a metaphysical matter that since the world, the cosmos, is the body of God and God's immutable, or God is imperishable, not immutable, imperishable or inexhaustible, that can't be case. It can't be that the universe is going to end in entropic dissipation. Then I say, well, if that's what panentheism is, I'm out, because it's got an a priori, which is one of the things that's wrong with metaphysics, classical metaphysics. It's got an a priori, which is going to defend itself in don't confuse me with the facts kind of metaphysics. But if you're willing to say that God is mortal like the rest of us, and that comes up at the end of the book.
And now I know y'all just had a conference around this. Ilya Dilio is hosting it, and I don't know what happened there, but in my head there are three different types of panentheism that each would have a different response.
Okay.
When panentheism became popular, there were a whole host of people within different, more confessional traditions that latched onto it without kind of buying all the big major theses of panentheism when Charles Hartshorne kind of set it out, like, here are all these things about God's relationship to time and such. The transcendence of God for certain kind of panentheists is ontologically robust enough. You'll get triggered if you talk to them, Jack. You'll say, whoa, 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 whoa. I know what this smells like, and it's a very old library in the Vatican that just got a little dusting. Other kinds of panentheism, I'd be interested in hearing how Catherine, if you and Catherine talked about it, because for some process people, every event becomes objectively immortal in God, right? And each event has happened. Its ultimate significance is that it's part of, if you use the symbol God or the divine life, or it shows up in the next moment. It's being inherited, and so when those kind of panentheists talk about different cosmological pictures, it starts with a kind of objective immortality as a given. And then you're thinking about other depths that you'll argue about. And then I think there's this mode of panentheism, what you're describing is one where whatever kind of ontological speculation that's taking place, its horizon matches our cosmological horizon in a way that duration or time, the way finite entities experience it and relate to it, would have a reciprocity to how whatever gets itself done in the concept God does. But like those schools all argue when they argue about panentheism all the time anyway. But yeah, anyway, that was my guess of what happened. Now I'm really interested, because when I saw all the advertising for it and then Ilya said you were coming, and I was like, oh, if only it was happening where I could hop over easily.
Catherine's general reaction to this is to say that you're talking about something of such incalculable distance, that is off at such an incalculable distance. So there's something idle about worrying about it or talking about it. My response to that is, well, that's certainly true. Global warming is a real problem, and the heat death of the universe is not. But it is, what I then do is use an old distinction from my Catholic youth from Gabriel Marcel, to distinguish a problem from a mystery. And that is, it's certainly not a problem, but it is a mystery in the sense that we're trying to talk about ultimate things. And if we want to think of God in terms of the world as the body of God, then it is relevant. Furthermore, it also has a rebound effect, I think, on global warming, because then you say, well, this is sort of a Camelot moment. Once there was a spot, one brief shining moment, there was a spot where we were alive and we celebrated, and we're intelligent, and we started to learn. We're this moment, and maybe there's many of them around the universe, where the universe becomes conscious of itself, and so it accentuates the uniqueness of the moment. In the case of Ilya, she's got a slightly different argument. She's got an argument about not about the cosmos, but about biological evolution that will reach this summit in the universal Christ consciousness. My argument there is, well, it's sort of like quantum theory versus general relativity. How are you going to put this together? Biological evolution is neg-anthropic, and it's building up towards higher and higher forms of consciousness, and maybe it will even achieve some kind of collective consciousness, although I'm not sure that's a great idea. But that's now. That's just a speck of time in cosmic time, and the Earth, all of this, all life, faces star death. Cosmic consciousness, first of all, it won't be cosmic consciousness, it'll be our consciousness. And then to say that somehow it will become cosmic with possible intelligences that are hundreds of millions of light years away, it's just far-flung, it's just far-flung. I think what Teilhard was talking about is a local phenomenon that is destined for, it's a short timer, cosmically speaking. That's what we go back and forth on. And we're going to have lunch tomorrow, so maybe we'll have more to report on it tomorrow.
Well, one of the things that in the discussion of it in the book, you say, so if we are pressed ontologically, how something without power can be unconditional, the answer is axiologically. Panentheism, for example, is penultimately right, not as an ontology, but as an axiology, not as a proposition, but as a prayer. Panentheism is right, not in the indicative, that God is all in all, but in the optative, that God may be all in all, that God may prove to be that in which we live, move, and have our being. That is our hope. One of the things I loved about that passage is the description of it is a description of a piety that would resonate with other kinds of panentheists, even if they would disagree on the ontology. But to lead with it, in some sense, like the kind of a panentheistic, prayerful phenomenology, like the phenomenology of praying panentheistically is the wager. And I think too often the kind of larger ontological questions occupy the debate in ways that the form of life that it's inviting us into is skipped.
That's exactly right. That's exactly my point. Yeah. I think all of these things, the truth of these things is the form of life. And that panentheistic prayer. Now notice in there the may be part.
Mm-hmm.
Not that God is.
I know this.
Will be.
You insert it in my head all the time, Jack. I've even added perhaps in the introduction of 2 books with a footnote to you, just because I know that once I start talking, I'm worried if you got to the 3rd chapter, you'd be like, I'm really worried about Tripp's confidence here. So just a footnote of perhaps every couple chapters.
I'm glad you singled out that passage. That really goes to the heart of the book. Yeah. And if you want to think panentheism that way, as the blaze of light, and there's a blaze of light in every word, and there's a blaze of light in the word God, but it's a blaze of light, and it goes out. But that's okay. Now, I don't want to say that's part of the eternal memory of God. I just want to say that is justified in and of itself and without why. That's another thing about teor that I don't think we need, is the notion of some kind of telos or omega or eschaton. The world worlds in and of itself, and it worlds without why. And that's what makes it precious. It's not a deal we're entering to see if we can come out ahead. It's not a game we're playing to see if we can win. It is without why. The rose is without why. It blossoms because it blossoms. Cares not if anyone sees it. That's that old Rhineland mysticism thing is, I think, profoundly true. Heidegger talked about the worlding of the world. And it worlds because it worlds. It worlds without why. It's a world play. It's a Weltspiel, Heidegger says. And he goes back to a fragment in Heraclitus. And Heraclitus says, the kingdom, and he actually says basileia in the Greek. The kingdom is in the hands of a child who plays. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a kind of mystical vision of the world's inherent value in worlding without why. Yeah. And that's not only compatible with mortality, it's actually intensified by mortality. I think that, you sometimes hear people say that God can't love because God can't be rejected. He can't put himself at risk. It's a classical notion, the Gothic God. He's got to be able to put himself at risk for love. To love, I make a gift, and it may not be returned. I put myself on the line. I put myself at risk, and I would be willing to put myself in harm's way for love. So I think mortality and perishability is actually a condition of possibility for love. And the mortality of the universe would not defeat its divinity. It would, in fact, be co-constitutive of it, which is the strongest way to hold that view. It's not just simply compatible with a more mortal God. It's not only an idea you could possibly get away with. It's actually about the only way that you could make God make sense, I think.
When you use the phrase like, the worlds, I feel like this happened when you were at the Philosophy of Religion conference at Claremont. You and Ingolf Dahlfeldt had a conversation around that, around the nature of hermeneutics, of the gift of faith. In some sense, could be talking about how the world becomes creation, and that task of hermeneutics and the way kind of the symbolic depth of a tradition erupts is in the reinterpretation of life's givenness towards the depth or towards the potential that's there. And it was one of those conversations where, as a student, you're listening to it and going, you kind of think you know what's going on in the assumptions, and then there's this shift of discussing how the world becomes creation and going, oh, that is a very different use of this language, as opposed to if you think, you go 500 years ago, debates about creation were so framed by a kind of classical theism, we knew what that language meant. But when the poetics of the divine are what reorient one's relationship to a worlding that doesn't know why, to a finite creature engaged in creation, that's a shift, but it's not a shift about metaphysics.
It's a shift in our imaginative figuration of the world, and it gives it it highlights something about the world that, Eckhart had that. Eckhart said God is the world. God is not a creator without us. God needs us. He got himself in trouble talking like that, but God needs us because God wants to create. So God wants to be creator and creation are internally related. And so without us, God is not God, he said, because by God he meant creator. It's another rendering of the world, another opening of the world. If religion understood itself to be a form of theopoetics, a form of life and a form of theopoetics. Someone asked me the other day, what does theopoetics have to do with the Gaza Strip? And I said, well, directly nothing, but I said, what you've got there is a sort of war of theocracies. They're warring theocracies. Is a Muslim theocracy, and then Netanyahu is just basically sold out to a right-wing Jewish theocracy. So you got a sort of war of theocracies. There's nationalism and a lot of other things going on. But if the religious element were theopoetic rather than theocratic, everything would be different. So there's something profoundly important about religion, but religion keeps getting in its own way. It keeps making itself look violent or foolish or both. And that's why I don't know what to do with the word religion anymore. It depends on what day you ask me.
How similar or different is your the contesting of religion internally to something like democracy? Because when I think of just over the time of our friendship, the growing instability of institutions generally, like in the same way at the beginning of the conversation, you talk about belief being problematized in deep, deep ways. I think the same kind of thing is sitting there around these beliefs that have been at the heart of democracy in relationship to its institutions.
Yeah. In a way that I never expected, never thought that. I never thought democracy was perfect. but I didn't think it was as fragile as it proven to be. I mean, you always wanted to say, don't confuse what we call democracy with democracy. Now I find myself not trying to destabilize democracy because it's become too powerful a structure, and too inclined to libertarianism and things. Now I find myself trying to protect it because it's we are very, very possibly on the edge of its destruction. I mean, I've never, ever. Well, the last time I ever thought something like that was back in the '60s when in the turmoil of the '60s. I mean, there were points there when the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy within a few months of each other. I remember then thinking, where will this stop? This is just chaos. We're on the edge of chaos. That's the last time I felt like this. Only this time I feel more deeply and profoundly troubled. I mean, you want to hold things in a state of optimal disequilibrium, not pure and simple disequilibrium. Chaosmos, not chaos. And we're on the edge of chaos now. If I didn't have children and grandchildren, I'd say it's your problem, not my problem. I'm 83 years old. It's your problem. But you can't think like that. But the word democracy, you were comparing the word democracy to religion. I think the word religion is more deeply troubled. I think it's almost gone. I'm not sure it can be saved at all. Whereas I don't feel like that about democracy at all. I'm deeply worried about it. But I think the word democracy, the energy, as we're saying, of democracy is real and palpable, whereas religion has now become become a word for the reactionary, anti-democratic, anti-scientific. I mean, you're always worried about science. We people in humanity are always arguing. Look, science is not God. I mean, there are other ways of thinking about the world besides science. Now we're defending science, right? We have to defend science against these people. I never thought it's going to have to do that. And if someone's going to have to defend democracy and science and vaccines, good Lord, what are we doing defending vaccines? How did we get here?
I don't think that's what world-renowned Derrida students were anticipating doing in their retirement.
No. I wanted to go on cruises.
Well, there you go. This it's been a complete blast to get to talk to you. For those of you that are getting to the end and going, oh, if you want to get your panentheistic at the axiological trajectory prayer on, then you can go check out What to Believe. 12 Brief Lessons in Radical Theology by John D. Caputo if you're going on the interweb looking for it. But, if you get to hang out with him in person, it's Jack. It's been a joy.
Great to see you, Trip, and keep up the great work. This stuff you're doing is absolutely indispensable, vital. You're reaching all kinds of people and bringing them the good stuff. And want you to keep at it. I've got my poster with the Homebrewed Christianity and downstairs with my books. And you remember that one with
Oh yeah,
Friar Jack and I gave you the line deconstructor.
Oh yeah,
right. Don't forget that. I give the footnote for that.
Yes. Though the first time we had the beer, no one gave you a heads up that it was stronger than your average beer. And
yes, and I remember saying a few things I would like to unsay.
Well, I don't know.
Arrow of time is irreversible.
Yeah, it's irreversible.
An eternal moment now.
And you giving Pete Rollins a hard time for being too Calvinist was quite enjoyable.
That's right.
Now everyone can go search back through the archives and find out wherever that episode is.
Well, there. It's there.
Thank you so much for listening. Hey, if you enjoyed this then tell a friend. It's called sharing the brew, metaphorically, homebrewed Christianity. If you got questions for us, just look on the podcast app that you're listening from this from. At the very bottom, there's like a little linky link where you could maybe, if you haven't subscribe, or leave a rating and review if you haven't done that. But there's one that says like drop a question and leave feedback. That you can send in text right in your phone, or turn on your phone's microphone and send a question. If you send some for Caputo, or you have ideas and stuff, drop them right there. They go right to me and help shape maybe a follow-up Q&A with Jack, or who I have on, or topics you want to hear. Yeah, consider doing it. All right, friends. Thanks.